Chapter 23. Murder was the case. Richard Nixon and his team looked at the way George Wallace had run his campaign. And felt like it was a good idea to follow in his footsteps. Nixon believed the segregationist approach was a good one because it would lock down all the true blue segregationists, like the Veracity Squad of racists. Among with those, Nixon figured it would attract the White House who were afraid of everything black. Black neighborhoods, black schools, black people. And the brilliant game plan, Nixon used to drive an even bigger wedge to get racism on his side was to simply demean black people in every speech, while also praising white people. I'm going to repeat that again. Nixon used to drive an even bigger wedge and to get racists on his side was to simply demean black people in every speech while also praising white people. But the magic trick in it all, that was what it was. But the magic trick in it all, the how could you hide that rabbit in the hat part, was that he did this all without actually saying black people and white people. It goes back to things of the world ghetto, and today maybe you've heard urban, or how about undesirables? Oh, and maybe not dangerous elements, which would eventually become thugs. Mother would call this getting over, but for the sake of the history book, let's go with history. Historians had named it the Southern Strategy, and in fact it was. It remained over for the next 5 decades. It's the national strategy Republicans used to unite Northern and Southern racists, war hawks, and official and social conservatives. So basically, they make people bad. Basically, it's like they're saying like they were demean the black people, make white people, and praise the whites, and don't actually mention black people and white people in a normal sense. That's how it was. The strategy was right on time, with the Southern strategy in full tilt, and with the messaging all about law and order, which meant doing anything to shut down protests, or at least paint them as bloodbaths. Richard Nixon won the presidency. In the fall of 1969, with Curly Mitchell's campaign behind her, Angelica Davis settled into a teaching position at the University of California, Los Angeles, but the FBI had other plans. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, had launched a war to destroy the Black Power movement that year. And all he needed to cut Davis down was to know that she was part of the Communist Party. Ronald Reagan, the governor of California at the time, had her fired from NUCL, and when she tried to plead her case, it set off a media storm. Hate mail started filling up her mailbox. She received threatening phone calls, and police officers started harassing her. And even though the California Supreme Court would overturn her firing and allow her to go back to work, Reagan searched for new ways to get rid of her, and he would succeed. The next time, he fired her for speaking out in defense for 3 black inmates in Soledad State Prison who she felt were detained only because they were Black Power activists. Here's what happened. George Jackson was transferred to Soledad from San Quentin after disciplinary infractions. He had already served some years and had been accused of robbing a gas station of $70. His sentence for that crime, 1 year to life in prison. In 1970, a year after arriving from Soledad, Jackson and feather black inmates John Couchette and Fela Jamogo were accused of murdering a prison guard and originally charged prison fight. However, whatever chance he had of freedom was now locked up with him between bars. Angelica Davis had become friends with George Jackson's other brother, Jonathan, who had been committed to freeing his brother. They had been rallying. Angelica Davis had been speaking. They had been fighting the good fight. But it wasn't enough for Jonathan Jackson, brother of George. He decided to take his freeing into the brother in his own hands. This is real. Pay attention. It's gonna go quickly. Jonathan Jackson walked into a courtroom in California, Marin Country. He was holding 3 guns. He took the judge, the prosecutor, and 3 jurors hostage. He freed 3 inmates who were on trial. He led the hostages to a van parked outside. Police opened fire. The shutout took the lives of the judge, 2 inmates, and also Jonathan Jackson. He was 17 years old. A week later, Angelica Davis was charged for murder. Record scratch, repeat. A week later, Angelica Davis was charged for murder because police said one of the guns Jonathan Jackson used was actually hers. Why are people acting? Why did she didn't even do anything in that escapade? And keep in mind, she did nothing during this escapade. She wasn't in that at all. That doesn't even this whole thing here. Jonathan Jackson wasn't around and Davis when he, took the judge, prosecutor, and the jurors into hostage. They were just trying to shut another person down for convenience. If found guilty, she'd be sentenced to death. Angelica went on the run. She was caught months later on the other side of the country, New York, October 13th, 1970. She was arrested and brought to the New York housewoman's house of detention. While she was there around so many other black and brown incarnated women, she began to develop her black feminist theory. On the other side of the prison walls, organizations were fighting and rallying for her freedom. And this cry continued after December 1970, when Davis was sent back to California, where she spent most of her time in solitary confinement, awaiting trial. She read the letters, thousands of letters from activists and supporters. She also studied her case, studied it. A year and a half later, her trial finally begun. She represented herself and won. On June 4th, 1970, Angelica Davis was free. But not free in her own mind until she could help all the women and men she behind bars get free. There was no value to her and her own exceptionism. She was an anti-racist. She knew better than to beat her chest when there was a much bigger challenge to be beaten. Much harder chains to break. 3 years later, Angelica Davis returned to teaching. Nixon had resigned from office after a scandal he was punished for no surprise. He wasn't punished for, and Gerald Floyd for president. Just telling you that because you'd probably be wondering what happened to Nixon, turns out he was a liar and couldn't, as my mom would say, get over. Anyway, Davis had taken a job at the college's Black Studies Center in Southern California, and she realized quickly that not much had changed since he'd been gone. Segregationists were still arguing some kind of natural-born problem with black people, and assimilationists were trying to figure out why integration had failed. And the one thing that black male assimilation scholars kept arguing about was that black masculinity was what was frightening to white men. That it was sexual jealousy that spawned genetic oppression, which was ridiculous, because it buys into the racist idea that black men were sexually superior, making them superhuman, making them not human. And also continues the narrative that black women just don't matter. Black women didn't have a place in the conversation, though they've been the steadying stick from the conversation begun. All this in line with decades, centuries of racist propaganda. I should note that there has been that we're helping out. There's this whole entire I know that there's this entire country they had suffered a giant explosion, and the majority of the men there are killed, and the majority of the people who survived were women, and the women were needed to keep that country alive. Keep in mind that there's literally a country out right now that probably has women. With the majority of the people that live there are women, because the majority of the men had died somewhere in an explosion. Countries of white men and white women and black men, all working to erase and discredit who they thought posed the greatest threat to freedom. Even if it's only in the case of black men, the freedom to pretend to be freer than they actually are. But what about the LGBT community? Were they not to be included in this conversation? Fortunately, there was media, but not another Tarzan or another Planet of the Apes. None other Uncle Tom's Cabin either. This time, just like with novelist Neil Hudson, who abandoned the past, written such a dialect into the mouths of strong women characters. Their eyes were watching God. Black women were screaming with white feminist, anti-racist work. Audre Lorde produced essays, stories, and poems from the perspective of being white. No, perspective of being black and lesbian. She pushed back against the idea that she, as a black person, woman, and lesbian, were expected to educate white people, men, and or heterosexuals in order to recognize their humanity. Exorine Shane used her critique anti-racist energy to produce a play for colored girls who had considered suicide / when the rain is a death. Portraying the lives of black women and their experiences of abuse, joy, heartbreak, strength, weakness, love, and longing for love. Some black people were afraid it would strengthen stereotypes of black women. Some were afraid it would strengthen stereotypes of black men. Both fears are code for the fear of an anti-racist truth. Anti Walker wrote The Colored Purple, a novel that represents a black woman dealing with abusive black men, abused Southern property, and abusive racist whites. The tired argument about the black male stereotype arose again. But so what? And Mitchell Walrence wrote a book called Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. Walrence believed that sexism was an even greater concern than racism. She was loved, but she was hated just as much. And while the idea of black masculinity was being challenged by black women, white masculinity was being threatened constantly by black men. So once again, white America created a symbol of hope. Of man. I mean man. Of macho. Of victor. And plastered it on the screen. Again, this time his name was Rocky. I'm sure you've seen at least one of the movies. Even if you've seen one of the new ones. If you haven't, the fight song. The song playing while Rocky runs up a set of musical steps, training tired but triumphant. Yeah. Rocky, played by Sylvester Stallone, was a poor, kind, slow-talking, Italian-American, humble, jaw-dropping, Italian-American boxer in Philadelphia. Cocky. He really. African-American world heavyweight champion. The new movies about Rocky's opponent, Albino Creed, the new movies are about his son, and his amazing thunderstorm of punches. Albino Creed, with his amazing thunderstorm, the rising black middle class, and the real-life heavyweight champion in the 1976, the pride of black power masculinity, Muhammad Ali. Rocky symbolized the pride of white supremacist masculinity's refusal to be knocked out from the thunderstorm of civil rights and black power protests and policies. Weeks before Americans ran out to see Rocky, though, they ran out to buy Alex Haley's Roots, the saga of an American family. Haley, who had been known to working with Malcolm X on his autobiography, had been basically written the slave story of all slave stories. It was a 700-page book, and made it into a miniseries that became the most watched show in television history. It blew up a bunch of racist ideas about how slaves were lazy brutes, mannies, and sambos, and how slave owners were benevolent and kind landlords. But as much as anti-racist black Americans loved their roots, Racist white Americans loved on-screen and off-screen their Rocky and his irrelevant fight for the law in order of racism. And then in 1976, their Rocky ran for president. End of chapter 23.